Hey friends, my name is Dasha. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going over all of my reading statistics for 2020. Really quickly before I start, I noticed this morning that I have, as of filming, 102 subscribers, and I just want to say thank you to anyone who takes the time out of their day to listen to one of my videos, to leave me a comment, or leave me some recommendations. I think that it's so cool that I get to share my hobby with people on the internet, and you guys actually seem to enjoy talking with me about books, so I appreciate it. So I track my reading through Goodreads like most people, and I also do have a spreadsheet that I use. So I use G from BOOKROAST'S CAWPILE spreadsheet. I will link her video down below where she kind of goes over it, but essentially it's just a reading tracker with things like, who the author is, what month you read it in, how many pages, what format. But she also uses the CAWPILE system, which is basically ranking each individual aspect of a work of fiction, so things like characters, atmosphere, writing, plot, intrigue, and it kind of gives you a star rating at the end. And the cool thing about this spreadsheet is that the CAWPILE system is integrated right into the spreadsheet, so you get your final star rating based on what you rate a book's individual characteristics. So I thought that was pretty cool. Again, it'll be linked down below so you can maybe go check it out for yourself. So most of the stats that I'm getting will be from Goodreads and from that spreadsheet. However, next year I am thinking of adding a few more spreadsheets. I really enjoy tracking things on the computer much more than I do in journals. As much as I love the look of a cute journal spread for reading, it's not practical for me. I can't get the statistics that I want out of it, so I definitely will be using more than one spreadsheet to track some different things, and I will go over what I am looking for in a spreadsheet. Yeah, it's gonna be not the most complete overview of all my stats for the year. Things like hauls or series are not included, but either way, there's still a lot of things to get through. I love watching people's stats videos every year. I love seeing how people thought they did versus how they actually did, and things like genres or which month was their best and all these things. I find it so much fun, so I'm gonna get into mine right now. So as of filming, I have finished 71 books this year. So according to Goodreads, that's 28,396 pages total. That's fine, but there's certain books that I read over only audiobook, and on my spreadsheet, I counted those and like their standard edition, like the one I would have picked up, and that amounts to 28,846 pages. So we're gonna, split the difference. It's gonna be 28,500 pages for the year, which is pretty cool. I don't have anything to compare it to because this is the only year I've ever tracked my reading, but it sounds pretty impressive. 28,500 pages sounds pretty dang cool. And according to Goodreads, my average book length was 405 pages, which makes a lot of sense. So my longest book this year was Storm of Swords by George R. R. Martin, which was 973 pages. And it felt like it. And then my shortest book was Prosper's Demon by K.J. Parker, which was 112 pages. So Goodreads says that my most popular book, which is absolutely not a surprise to me, was Divergent by Veronica Roth. Over 4 million people have shelved this book, and obviously there was the movie. It was a big craze back in like 2012-13, so that's not a surprise. But funnily enough, my least popular book that I read was Kilo by Toby Muse, and if you watched my favorites of 2020, which I will link, that was one of my favorite books of the year. It just kind of had such an impact on me, but only 941 people shelved it. And I know it's a newer release and like there's a lot of nonfiction books that come out, but that one kind of hurt a little bit. I want more people to pick it up. So when I look at my monthly statistics, of all months, February was my best reading month. I read 9 books, which totaled to 3,753 pages. And it is the shortest month of the year, so I'm pretty surprised. However, there was 2 rereads in that month, so it's not a complete shock that I was able to read through a couple of books more quickly than others, because it wasn't the first time I was experiencing those. But either way, 9 books for me is a lot, because most of my other months, if I kind of look at an average, 6 books per month is kind of my usual standard, so 9 was pretty impressive. So when it comes to the general age of my books, 70% of my reading is adult. And while I don't have any goals particularly with this stat, it does make sense. I think at the beginning of the year I was reading a bit more young adult because I was still figuring out really what I like, and I was picking everything up just to kind of get back into reading. And it's easier to get back into reading with young adult because they're a little bit more digestible, a little bit less thought-provoking a lot of the times, so it was a lot easier to get back into reading with those. But it kind of evened out over the year, and now there's a lot more adult than young adult. So 27.1% of my reading was young adult, and then there was like 2 middle grade books that account for that discrepancy in the numbers. So I think, I mean, again, it's not like a goal of mine. I do still enjoy young adult, and it's not like a statistic I'm trying to change, but it definitely was interesting to see that just naturally I did start to gravitate towards adult reading more. It also helps that I read a lot of nonfiction. I do enjoy classics and thrillers, which all tend to be more on the adult side. So my most read genre, to absolutely nobody's surprise, is fantasy. I read 32 fantasy books this year, which accounted for 45.7% of my reading. However, I will note that this tracker tracks things like manga and graphic novels as a genre, as well as like paranormal and mythology and all this stuff. Like, it tracks them separately. So, for example, if I read a fantasy or a paranormal manga, I was like, just to make my life a little bit easier, I will track those as fantasy. Mythology I tracked separately because I'm interested to see actually how many mythological retellings or mythology-based books I do pick up. But when it came to things like magical realism or paranormal, I just class this all as fantasy. It's just a lot easier for me. And then my next most read genres are split. There's 2 of them with 9 books each, and that is nonfiction and thrillers. I'm surprised I read as many thrillers as I did, because normally I only listen to them on audiobook, and I didn't read that many audiobooks this year because I wasn't commuting. But on the flip side, I'm also happy that I got to as much nonfiction as I did, because I was worried that I wasn't going to read as much as I wanted to. My video for 2021 goals is going up right before this one, so I will link that here, and I do talk about wanting to read at least 1 nonfiction a month. And that's definitely something that I was trying to kind of, as like a soft goal, do for myself this year. And I got kind of close, like 9, you know, a softer goal instead of 1 a month is 10 in case they're a little bit more dense, or it's like a school month and I don't really want to read nonfiction. But 9 is still pretty good, and obviously I'd like to push that number higher, but I'm pretty happy that I got to 9. So in that goals video, along with reading 1 nonfiction a month, I also say that I want to read 1 classic a month, and that is especially going to be a challenge for me because this year somehow I only got to 2 classics. That hurt my feelings a lot. I like classics. I really do enjoy reading classics, but obviously they take a bit more brain power. They take a bit more digestion. You have to kind of sit with them a little bit. And I guess this year, I don't know if it was the pandemic or just like struggling with school and stuff, but I didn't want to waste my brain power on that, I guess. And that kind of hurts because I have a ton of them that I want to read. I have a ton of them that I own that I'm like itching to read. I just haven't gotten around to it. So again, that's going to change next year. I'm going to push myself to read 1 a month. Soft goal of 10 if I can't do 1 a month, but 2 is pretty pitiful for me. So 47.1% of my books, so 32 books, were 4 stars. That's amazing. To me, that just says that I had a really good reading year. I read quite critically. I tend to always read with things like plot and characters and writing in mind. And it's pretty, I don't know, I think it's pretty cool that I managed to pick up a ton of books that were considered 4 stars to me. And then 3 and 5-star books were evenly split, with 23.5% of my reading being 3 stars and 23.5% being 5 stars. Only 4 books throughout the whole year were 2 stars, which is pretty good. I'm not too upset about that. And according to Goodreads, my average rating was 3.9, which makes sense. Looking back at this and looking through my stat sheet with all the books and their ratings, I kind of think that as I read more and more, my ratings changed a little bit. There's some books that I did give 4 stars that I would probably drop down to a 3. And some books need a reread for me to kind of really see where I stand now. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's quite normal that as your reading changes, as you read more in a specific genre or category, I think it's definitely normal that your ratings can change a little bit. When I do my ratings, I do rate according to what kind of category the books fall into their age range. So obviously I rated Percy Jackson 4 stars, but it's not the same as rating Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna Maguire 4 stars, or rating some of my nonfiction like Blitzed 4 stars. they're completely different and I try to rate them somewhat accordingly. But looking back, I think that I definitely could tighten up my qualifications for ratings, if that makes sense. I could definitely reassess how some books went, so the stats might change a little bit if I do go back to this. But overall, like, I can't think of a ton of books that I have negative feelings towards. Even the disappointing ones, a lot of them were still quite good. So I would consider this a successful reading year. It's amazing that I had so many 3, 4, 5 stars. You know, I didn't read a lot of duds this year, and that's always something to celebrate if you ask me. The other thing too is I'm wondering if CAWPILE is maybe skewing my rating, because I would go through and give what I thought were fair ratings based on each category, and then it would give me a 4-star rating when I thought the book felt like a 3-star to me. And I know it's like such a tiny thing, because at the end of the day, what you want to rate it is what you want to rate it, but then it made me reconsider and I was like second guessing myself. So that's one of the reasons I'm kind of looking at different trackers. CAWPILE will just be to kind of supplement if in case I really am not sure how to feel about a book, instead of having to go through that process for every single book, even if I already know what I want to rate it. So that's one of the reasons I am looking towards other spreadsheets possibly. So the next stat that this spreadsheet tracks is POC versus not POC authors. So 20% of the authors I read from this year were POC. I'm not sure where the stat is really supposed to land. I will say that it's one of those things that, to be quite honest, at the beginning of the year, I wasn't even sure why I was tracking it. Like, I will completely admit I wasn't sure why this was a thing, but then just being in the book community, there is a lot of discourse about how publishing is like mainly white. And then I started noticing that, you know, fantasies that are set in alternative settings written by POC authors often have a very unique edge to them. Also, reading nonfiction from POC authors is really interesting because you do get that other worldview, and that's one of the reasons I read. I love to experience things that are outside of my own reality and experience, so I think I will continue to track this. I don't know where this number is supposed to land, and I do feel comfortable admitting that because obviously, you know, just being part of the book community, at least I was aware that this is something that you should be mindful of when you're picking up books. Luckily, I read everything under the sun. I do find I read diversely in terms of genre, which naturally kind of allows me to pick up diverse books. And the other thing too is I know that publishing is extremely white. I think there was that graph that was going around that like only 5% of books that were published since like the 20s were by POC authors. So even compared to that statistic, my reading is already more diverse than what's being published. I will continue obviously to pick up stuff outside of my own experience, and I will continue to track it to see if, now that I'm mindful of this conversation, maybe my reading does gravitate more towards things outside of my experience. So I'm interested to see how it goes from here, but like I said, I do feel pretty glad and already proud of myself that my reading is so diverse in terms of genre that it naturally lends itself to me picking up diverse books, because I'm not just reading nonfiction about the Western world. I do want to read more about every single culture. I read a lot of history books, and that includes a lot of different history. I love picking up fantasy written by diverse authors because they bring some of their own culture into it. For me, it's like a natural thing, so I'm curious to see if, especially now that I'm aware of this conversation, if my reading will change. So another stat that I initially was not super interested in tracking, and I still don't know if it's something that I care too much for, is the gender of the author that I read from. So 50% of the authors I read from were male, and 40.6% were female. The small discrepancy is the one non-binary author I read from this year. And it feels like an arbitrary thing to me. Again, because I already read from so many different genres, it's not like I'm picking up only adult fantasy, which skews heavily towards male authors. I read a little bit of everything, so I feel as though I don't really need to like work on anything in that stat, but I did think that it was interesting that it did lean more male. It's not something I noticed because I do read, for example, young adult fantasy a lot of the times is written by female authors. A lot of the thrillers that I've read have been by female authors. So it's kind of, it's interesting, I guess, to just see it, but it's not something that I want to work on to get it to 50-50 because I don't think it skews too much to either side. So 51.4% of the books I read this year, which is about 36 books, were physical books, which meant that most of them were from my own TBR because I don't borrow from the library physically and I don't borrow from friends. So that's good to me. That means that I read a lot of books that I already own, which makes me feel better about the size of my TBR. So my current own TBR is setting at around 72 books. And as far as I know, all year I've managed to keep it to under 75, which means that I really am reading about half of what I bring in. So that is pretty, like, it's pretty nice to see that and be reassured that I am reading books I own. One thing I will say is next year, one of the trackers that I did find that I think I will use includes a haul tracker. So how many I buy versus when I actually read them, where did I buy them from, which I'm always interested in because I buy a lot of books from Value Village. So I'm curious to see how many of my books I actually buy from there versus brand new, because we all love a brand new book. That new book smell is just unbeatable. So I'd be really curious to see how many of them I bought this year, how many I bought last year, speaking for 2021, how many I bought used, how many I bought new, and which ones I actually read. And then 29 books, so about 41% were ebook, and 5 books, so like 7% were an audiobook. Normally, I do know that my audiobook number is higher, but since I wasn't commuting, again, I didn't really read that many. I do love all 3 formats. I feel like they all have their use. Obviously, I love curling up with a good physical book, but if I'm traveling to work and to school and to my boyfriend's house, I do like having the ebook on my iPad, either from the library or from Scribd, or like an owned one from the Apple bookstore. And audiobooks are fantastic for commuting. It takes me over an hour to get to work on days that I work. It's at least a 45-minute drive to campus, it's 35 minutes to my boyfriend's house, and it's just opportunities that I can use to read. So now that I don't travel around nearly as much, it's kind of taken that away from me. A lot of the times I listen to thriller on audiobook, for example, and since lockdowns happened, I don't think I've listened to a single thriller. They were all at the beginning of the year when I was commuting. So it's kind of interesting to see how that has affected my reading, even in terms of the genres that I read. Forget the format, like even the genres have been impacted. So it's going to be interesting to see how next year goes. So that was it for the stats that I have collected. I also have like year of publication, but those were so all over the place that I didn't really think it was worth to discuss because I don't even find them that interesting. Overall, looking at the stats is fun. I love when like there's the pretty little pie charts made for you and you get to visualize your reading for the year. Because when you're reading, you have that kind of micro view on what you're doing, and this macro view of everything makes you really realize how much your reading skews towards certain things. Obviously, I knew that like fantasy was going to be my most read genre. I knew that, I remember that, my best reading month was February. I think my worst one was April. I think I finished like 2 books because exams, I got my Switch. I just wasn't reading that much. But it's interesting to like visualize it all. I think that next year, like I mentioned, I do want to track my hauled books. The tracker that I found that has the hauls also has a series tracker, so it's going to be kind of interesting to keep track of my series because when I think about them, I have 1,000,001 started series and I'm very, very bad at continuing them, so it's going to be maybe shameful to see them all laid out. Who knows? Maybe it'll shame me into reading them. Like I said, hauls would be interesting to see where I haul books from, if they're brand new, if they're gifts, how many I actually buy full price versus used. I found this in that one spreadsheet that I think I am going to use. There's a little section for like, have you written or filmed a review for it? Is it in progress? Where are you posting the review? And that's one thing I completely forgot to mention in my goals video because I guess I have a lot more than I thought. I do want to at least write or film a review for every book I read. Maybe filming is not realistic. There might not be enough to say about books. Sometimes we all read books that are like, meh, you don't have a lot of thoughts, it didn't really leave any kind of impact on you, so I'm not saying for every single book, but I think I'd like to at least write a Goodreads review for everything I read. And that's going to be cool to track it on the spreadsheet where I can basically remind myself like, oh, that box is not checked off, write a review, bitch, get to it. And of course, all the same categories as above, I will continue tracking them. Most spreadsheets do include this kind of thing, and like I said, it's fun to see little pie charts and numbers for everything that you read. So I'm I'm gonna keep tracking my reading. I think it's a lot of fun, and I will link any of the other spreadsheets that I might be using if I can find where I got them from. I'll link them down below. I do really love the idea of having spreadsheets for reading. I love that computers have progressed to where they make pretty little colorful pie charts for you. You don't have to put in any work, and then you can proudly show it off to others on the internet. So that was it for all my stats for my 2020 reading. Let me know what your best reading month was, and if you track your reading, I'm always curious to see how people track them. I know a lot of people use journals and a lot of people use stats like this. Some people only use Goodreads. I'm always curious to see what people are doing. All my social media is linked down below as usual. You guys can always come talk to me there, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!